All right, today we're talking about interest groups and lobbying. Remember, we still have to wear masks today. I got an email this morning that someone in this class is testing for COVID right now, so this may be continuing. I'll let you know next week, but as of right now, put on your mask, please, sir. Thank you. As of right now, we're still in quarantine for the rest of this week. That means in labs also. All right, in labs also. I'll tell you next week whether quarantine's been lifted. I really did get another email this morning. So, all right. We have a constitutional foundation of interest groups, the right to petition, right, in the First Amendment. And we also have the framers' view in Federalist 10. That, remember, Madison talking about factions, right, and that they are inevitable. Why are factions inevitable, you guys? Call back to like early September. Why are factions inevitable? It's not been quite 2 months. Why? People group together over mutual self-interest, right? And so the more freedom we have of thought, of conscience, the more ideas we have, and the more diversity that we have in terms of the way that we build these factions. Mass, please. Are factions and interest groups the same thing? What do you guys think? Well, probably. You know, I mean, Madison, I don't think necessarily envisioned them quite this way. Not quite so single-minded, all right? He saw them as kind of larger interests. So some interest groups really fall under this. So we could say, you know, a farmer's interest group, right? You could see that happening. A General Chamber of Commerce interest group, you could see that being, you know, a faction. But I don't think he saw quite the specificity of interest groups that we have today. And so, in some ways, parties echo this idea of factions, but they're a little bit too big, right? And so some of the larger interest groups are good examples of that. Some of the more insular parties, like the Green Party, might be more of a faction, okay? So let's get back to the basics, right? What exactly are interest groups? Interest groups come in 5 different types. Public interests, economic interests, professional groups, ideological groups, and single issue groups. Okay, so let's talk about each one of them. Public interest, okay? What's an example of a public interest group? You guys have done your Cengage for today, so you know this answer. What's an example of a public interest group?
Sierra Club.
Sierra Club, right? And the purpose of the Sierra Club is to say, hey, look, the environment and preserving green spaces and forests and wildlife and things like that in general is good for all of us, right? It's good for all of us. Why? What's a reason that's in public interest? Yeah.
We all benefit.
We all benefit. That's exactly it, okay? Everybody benefits. Everybody benefits from a public interest group. Public interest groups are the groups that are most likely to fall victim to the free rider problem, okay? And the free rider problem is essentially this. Hey, I like breathing clean air, but somebody else is going to worry about that. It's out there. I'm not too concerned. I like drinking clean water, but I don't want to pay more taxes for the city of Norman to clean it up, right? It's somebody else's problem, okay? So the environment is one of those things that often falls under public interest groups. Other things like that are, again, things that benefit us all as a whole. Most likely, these are the things that we're most likely to kind of sweep under the rug, right? Or not sweep under the, but not think about, right? And so we ride along for free, the free riders. We benefit from the work of others, making sure we have clean air, okay? Economic interest groups are the least likely to fall under the free rider problem. Why? What are economic interest groups? Let's start there. Give me an example. Example over here, you guys. Give me an example of an economic interest group. I know you guys have one right here. I feel it. Okay, we're in Oklahoma. What's a big economic interest group in Oklahoma? Oil, right? Energy production. That's a giant economic interest group in Oklahoma. I read a statistic the other day that oil, gas, and coal together, combined, employ 3% of the country. Okay, 3% of the country. But in Oklahoma, those numbers are much bigger. Right? Okay? Other economic interest groups include things like labor unions. Okay? They also include things like banks. They also include things like insurance companies. They include things like farmers' organizations. Okay? So economic interests. Those don't have the problem of free riders because people are very interested in maximizing, and they pay to make sure that their interests are protected in this way. Okay? Labor unions are one of the ones that are more likely to fall under this, right? Well, the union guy will take care of it, everybody else is in the union, so why bother? I'm not going to join. And we see a lot of that happening when you have open shops. Okay, which we will not really talk a lot about, but if you want to talk about it in another class, it's available. Professional groups. What's an example of a professional group? Up here, guys. Professional group. What do you want to be when you grow up? Why are you in college? What are you going to do? You're going to be a doctor. So what's a professional group for doctors? The American Medical Association, right? I'm a member of the American Bar Association, the Oklahoma Bar Association, because I'm a lawyer. I'm also a member of University Women, right? The Organization for University Women. I'm also a member of, some other things like that. My mother, who was a high school teacher. How many of you want to be teachers? A few? All right. My mom, what group would she be a member of? What group would you be a member of? The National Education Association, or the Oklahoma Education Association, right? Or the Texas Education, Arkansas, et cetera, okay? So these are professional groups. These are also, people free ride a lot on them, but they have really specific interests, and they advocate really specifically for the profession, right? And so it's not so much an economic interest so much as it is a protection of the interests in terms of the way it's regulated more than anything else, but also in conveying those interests. Okay, so the Association of University Women, for example, would be advocating for what? Can you guys guess?
Women's rights.
What?
Women's rights.
Women's rights specifically where?
Equality.
In universities, right? Equality in universities. And so that means things like pay for professors, but it also means like opportunities for students, okay? Ideological groups. What are some examples of ideological groups? The NRA is an ideological group. The NRA is sometimes considered more of a single issue group too, but I think it has some ideological in the way that it has turned. It's kind of turned more ideological than single issue. So I think that's a good example. What else we got?
Flat Earth Society.
What?
The Flat Earth Society.
The Flat Earth Society, absolutely ideological, yeah. Okay, what else? The ACLU, an ideological group. Okay. The Southern Poverty Law Center, okay, an ideological group. All right, so they're really focused on particular ideas and the protection of those ideologies and those ideas, okay? So protecting ideas, protecting them and promoting those. And those get, again, those are things that people don't, they're subject somewhat to free rider. Hey, I like free speech, but I'm not necessarily going to join the ACLU, right? And so they do have that problem, but at the same time, a lot of them are high profile enough that they get a lot of donations. Okay, single issue groups. Give me some examples of single issue groups. The NAACP, okay, absolutely. Okay, what else? Eric?
The Pacific Whale Foundation.
What? What kind of hat are you wearing right now, Eric?
Stop whaling.
Stop whaling now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Pacific Whale Foundation, I'm a member of the Pacific Whale Foundation because many years ago I was in Hawaii and I was on a whaling tour and I really liked the t-shirts they were wearing. And so I wanted a t-shirt, so I joined so I could have the t-shirt. And then every year they send me something saying, don't you want a, tote bag or something? And I'm like, all right, here's another $30, right? Or whatever. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit, but this is one of the ways they avoid free rider problems. I like whales. I think whales are cool. I like their t-shirts a lot. So a lot of times we join these groups simply to get the swag, frankly. I mean, this is why Eric's a member, okay? So he likes the hat. So, we do a lot of that, and that's how they promote themselves, too. Now, this doesn't necessarily pay for them. For example, the Pacific Whale Foundation, their big donor is Oprah. Oprah has a house in Hawaii, and she's it. She gives them some cash, and everybody else just wears shirts, right? So, but Oprah is the one who gives them millions of dollars. And so they have donors, and then they have kind of membership. Membership helps them in terms of saying, hey, we have 1 million members. We have people who care about this. But donors are what keep things going. Okay? They need both. Okay. So we have some evolution of law-abiding lobbyists, right? My opening track there was, hey, lobbyists aren't all bad. Or aren't bad, generally is what the opening track was. So we have the First Amendment, that right to petition, and free speech. Both of those things are really key. And then we have this Federal Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946, which required for the first time in 1946 for lobbyists to submit financial reports. They have to submit financial reports, where they spent money, who they gave money to, what the money was spent on exactly, okay? So the Federal Legislative Reorganization Act of 46 is the first time we see lobbyists really being regulated. But we really see lobbyists being regulated in 1946 because it's the first time that it's become an issue, right? The size of the federal government has expanded so dramatically during the New Deal, right? During World War II, that we have this federal government that is super open to lots of people. As a matter of fact, soon after this, well, in about 14 years after this, right now in 1946, Dwight D. Eisenhower is what in 1946? He's not president yet, that's my hint.
Supreme Allied Commander.
He is the Supreme Allied Commander. I'll talk about that later, because it's the coolest title ever, okay? I mean, why would you give that up for president? I mean, you get to wear a cape, I think. So, but at this time, that's where he is. Later on, whenever he leaves the military and runs for president, he registers to vote and then runs for president, like literally, like we'll talk about that later too. But he runs for president, and whenever he's going out of office, he gives a speech, and he says, hey, you guys need to watch out for this military-industrial complex that is directing our policy in the United States. And he's talking about this. What's happening starting in the mid-1940s is that you have defense industries going, wait a second, World War II is winding down, but we've been making a lot of money. We want to keep it going. So let's get some money to make sure that keeps happening. We'll talk more about that later. The Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 is going to really, really tighten things up, okay? This is where we're going to start limiting gifts pretty dramatically. It's going to require interest groups to provide formal reports on their lobbying activities, including all contact with different branches. Before it was just financial disclosure, now it's any contact at all. And then the Act of Honest Leadership and Open Government Act of 2007, it's going to do something else. It's going to restrict congressional members and their staff from moving straight into the private sector and then back into government. Okay, we're going to talk about that in just a second. It's going to restrict that from happening because it was happening like, hey, I'm working for this member of Congress. Now, the next day, I'm working for Boeing. Hello, member of Congress, remember me who just used to write your speeches? Can we talk about Boeing? Is that an issue? It's an issue, right? So this puts some time limits on it. They say, hey, you have to wait, a little bit of time. In the 1970s, we had this advocacy explosion. And we talked about this a little bit with Theda Skocpol, right? Remember those ideological groups and Skocpol's checkbook democracy, right? Checkbook advocacy, how people are participating by writing checks at that point. So we're seeing this explosion at that time. But we have business groups that are flocking to DC. We have professional groups that are saying, hey, we want to make sure that the dentists are represented properly, that the doctors, that the lawyers, that the accountants, that our business is properly taken care of, ophthalmologists, right? And we have public interest groups, patrons and contributors. These are really going to matter, right? Again, patron, that would be Oprah, right? Contributors, Eric and me. He gets a t-shirt, he gets a hat, I get a t-shirt, right? Law firms in DC are often lobbyists for hire. One of my favorite people in the world, and he graduated from the University of Oklahoma. He was considered the, I think, third most powerful person in DC about 10 years ago, about 15 years ago, I think, 10 to 15 years ago. And he was considered that as someone, his name was Joel Jankowski, and it's because he was the head of the lobbying side of Aiken Gump. He had a tremendous amount of influence. He had been Carl Albert's chief of staff. And his role as a lobbyist and a lawyer, right? He was considered the third most powerful person in Washington, D.C. Okay? Think about that. And like I said, this is a person I personally admire and I like very much. I would not indicate that there's anything nefarious about him. I'm just saying he had a tremendous amount of power because of where he was positioned and what he did. So beyond registered lobbies, there's also a vast influence system, in particular religious groups, okay? And I want to talk about that for just a second. One of the things that should be noted is if you are registered as a religious group, okay, a church, a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, what have you, right? If you're registered as this means you don't have to pay taxes. This means the people you employ do not have to pay taxes. Okay? And we have seen, because of this giant sort of tax loophole, kind of this enormous amount of groups that are maybe religious, but maybe more ideological, registering as religious groups to take advantage of that. Okay? This is something you should know. Remember, this is something that in particular Thomas Jefferson is concerned about, that separation of church and state. Right? And so part of this taxation issue is this. If you are tax exempt, if you are a charity or a church that is completely tax exempt, this means you cannot advocate for political persons or parties. Now, I'm not going to ask you to identify your church or anything like this, but have you ever heard from the pulpit an advocation for a particular political candidate? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay? I think probably more of you have, honestly. Okay? And when we're talking about that, what that means is, that means your church, your temple, your synagogue, whatever, they're in jeopardy. They could lose that tax-exempt status. Whenever I was a rather presumptuous undergraduate, political science major, I was at home at my church, my local church that I grew up in, and there was a sermon on a Sunday night given by the education minister, and he very clearly advocated for particular political activities and particular votes in the upcoming election. And at the end of it, me being a whole 21 years old and very full of myself, took him aside and I said, just so you know, that's illegal. And if you do it again, I'm reporting you to the IRS. So, I'm just saying, threaten them with the IRS, they tend to straighten up a little bit, right? So, there's a vast influence system. Religious groups have this ability to do that. Hyperpluralism is also kind of an outcome of this, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So what is a lobbyist? A lobbyist is a representative of interest groups who meet with members of Congress, or members of bureaucracy, or members of the governor's staff, or the president's staff, members of, at the state level, with locals at local levels, at this point. I mean, it's everywhere. And they are trying to persuade them of their position on issues. They work for an interest group, and they're trying to persuade them of their interests on issues. They're often policy experts, lawyers, etc. Okay? Many lobbyists were active in the political arena, so they were staffers or they were office holders before they became lobbyists. Why would you move from being a staffer to being a lobbyist? Money. That's exactly right. It's a whole lot better paid, if you're working as a lobbyist than if you're working as a congressional staffer. Yeah.
Military too, you've seen people go for active duty contracting.
And that's a perfect example. Government contracting is a great example of this, where you're going to see military members go directly into contracting. All right, and that's not prohibited in those ways that other things are. But they have to stay there for a little bit before they can come back and start lobbying. Okay, but you can see an immediate. I walked out of the military. My father-in-law walked out of the military, retired, and immediately became a contractor, making 5 times as much money. Right? My husband did the same for a couple of years, and he says he made a lot of money, but I've never seen it. Right? So I was like, "What did you do with all that money?" He's like, "I'm not really sure." And I was like, you said you had this car. I left it in Serbia. I'm like, what? What are you talking about? You left it. It doesn't matter. So, anyway, most lobbyists are active in the political arena for lobbying representatives, senators, staff, etc. So, which one of these fits you best? I'm going to ask you guys to raise your hand. How many of you think that lobbyists are evil? Raise your hand. How many of you think that they are necessary? Raise your hand. How many of you think it depends? All right, fair enough. Okay, so we're moving towards necessary and depends. That's, I think a slightly better view of lobbyists than normal. All right, so lobbyists are good because they inform legislators. They do a really good job of informing people who are not experts in an area about the policy area. Okay, they provide a lot of actual factual information. And let me tell you this, okay? If lobbyists provide information that is not factual, and a member of Congress goes into a committee meeting and advocates using that information, and then is embarrassed by the fact that it is not factual information, then that lobbyist will not work again, will not get access again to that member of Congress. So it does matter that they give quality information. There's multiple viewpoints, we can get lots of different things. While there are the same facts, and I want to be really clear about this, there are no such thing as alternative facts. There's fact and there's fiction, okay? There's truth and there are lies, okay? However, there are different viewpoints, right? We don't know what causes everything. We don't know what adds this. We say, looking at these numbers, I can kind of say that this may be something that we should do to fix this, but you know what? This should be something that we do to fix this too. And maybe those are at odds, right? There are different viewpoints. There are not different facts. And it also increases representation, right? So even though it's difficult, a lot of times it's really difficult. Let's go back to my deadhead boyfriend, right, Jerry, right? It's really difficult for my deadhead boyfriend to feel that he was, represented by Congress, right? Because for one thing, he didn't care, right? But it made him very happy that High Times had lobbyists or drug advocacy or legalization advocates existed to put his cause forward, right? He felt represented by that. There's a group that I can connect to. And that's oftentimes, like I said, not everybody has the same exact single issue that Jerry had, which is probably good. But we do have single issues that we care about, and those groups, we feel represented by them. The NRA, right? The Pacific Whale Foundation, the ACLU, all right? But in a lot of ways, they're also bad. That hyper-pluralism I was talking about, it's really difficult sometimes to cut through the chatter. There are so many different points that are being advocated for. There's so much information that sometimes it's hard to cut through the chaff and find the wheat. This hyper-pluralism sometimes clogs up the processes of government. Sometimes, right? Too many voices. Too many voices. They also tend to have one-track minds, all right? So the Pacific Whale Foundation cares about whales in the Pacific. They don't really care about whales in the Atlantic. They don't really care about dolphins. They have no viewpoint on, other things that are not related to Pacific whales. And so when we talk about things, they're like, we must preserve the whales. And the whales do what? They eat in Alaska and they mate in Hawaii. That's what they do. They have a path, just so you know. That's what whales do. the northern whales. It's, that's their life. All right? Okay? So it may be the opposite, but that's pretty much their life. I'm not a very good member. All right? But that's their life, and so that's what you're concerned about. You're concerned about that trade route. You're concerned about ships going through that corridor. You're concerned about those actions. And so that blinds you to kind of a larger ecological view, right? And it's the same sort of thing. If you're concerned about carbon emissions, right, then it's really difficult to think about jobs, okay? And so a holistic view is hard. And so members of Congress are going to hear from people who are advocating and say, hey, look, we have got to get rid of these carbon emissions, right? And so these are the ways that you do it. You do all these things. And somebody over here is saying, hey, look, I'm a labor union, and I would like my people to continue to be employed and make money and pay taxes and then keep the economy going, right? And there's a way to look at both of those things, but interest groups can't do it. They're singular. They're focused. And then there's kind of this other thing. Money over citizens, right? We're going to talk about it in a little bit, but business interests spend 5 times as much as every other group. And they're only concerned about one thing, and that's money. And that's money. So, we have this revolving door problem, like I said. 42% of U.S. representatives and 50% of senators become lobbyists after they leave Congress. If I am a representative for Oklahoma's 4th District, and I get voted out, then I'm going to move to D.C., I'm going to get a job paying me about $500,000 to $1 million a year, which is a lot more than I was making as a representative. And I'm going to go talk to all the people I talk to every day who know me by name for whatever cause that just employed me. They have a 1,400% pay raise for becoming a lobbyist. That's not small. I would like a 1,400% pay raise. It's not going to happen. But... So there are 2 different kinds of types of lobbying. That's one of your questions there today. direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. And direct is efforts of professional lobbyists to influence the policy process in Washington, D.C., or at the state level, or at local levels, okay? Lobbyists influencing the policy process. Grassroots are activity of interest group members rather than professional lobbyists in writing, calling, or visiting public officials. One of the things that the NRA used to do really effectively is you get a magazine every month from the NRA, and in it is a yellow card. And they say, tear out this yellow card, postage are paid, put your name on it, and send it into your member of Congress. And people did. And so members of Congress would have stacks, and you know, on one side would say, you know, don't vote for this legislation, or vote for this legislation, or whatever, right? But they would have stacks from their constituents. Boxes of yellow cards. People care about this. It was really effective. Okay? Other grassroots is just people calling in. I'm calling my member of Congress. My husband the other day, we were having an issue and with someone, and he said, well, let's just call our member of Congress. I said, well, sweetie, probably maybe our state representative would be better on that. And maybe before we do that, we should also talk to, you know, this person at this agency instead. But that was his first instinct, right? It was his first instinct. What's the point of them being there if they can't help us? Right? And that's not wrong, okay? That's not wrong. I'm just saying knowing where to direct this is helpful. Direct lobbying includes in-house lobbying, and those are people who work for a company. So, for example, the University of Oklahoma employs a lobbyist. This lobbyist has an office in the Office of Legal Counsel and goes to the Capitol and lobbies on our behalf. Okay? That's an in-house lobbyist. You can also just hire contract or consultant lobbying. And remember I was telling you about Joel Jankowski? Aiken Gump, right? This is a contract consultant lobbying firm. And I've actually had Joel talk to one of my classes before. And he talked about this, and he said, you know, not everybody does this, but our company, or our law firm, we got together and we set down some ground rules. And also, before we hire or we are hired by a client, we decide, right? But there's some things we didn't do. And so when we were making these ground rules in the late 1980s, one of the decisions we made is that we would not take money from big tobacco. We're not going to do that, okay? So that's a decision that they made. And so sometimes it's going to be ideological. This law firm works here, or this law firm works here, right? And sometimes it's going to be a little bit more open than that. So, what are some examples of grassroots lobbying at the federal or state level? Can you guys think of things? I gave you the NRA example. Yes?
My grandpa's actually a pastor at like a church in Newcastle, and they have someone that goes up to the state capitol like probably once a month and lobbies for them.
So we have a church in Newcastle, which has IRS exemption, right? Who is using money from the church to lobby at the state capitol. Illegal, but still lobby, okay? All right, what else?
Some of the clubs on campus lobbies.
On campus lobbying? Yeah, okay. And you see that happening too? Okay. What else? A campaign ad from a third party that encourages you to contact your member of Congress. That's perfect. Call your member of Congress. You don't want them to vote for House Bill 1213. You know, that's typical. Okay? So here's some lobbying tactics. Throw some money at it. Talk to them. Just write lots of emails. Cut off their heads. Okay. So money does not always prevail. I mean, I'm not saying money's not important, because look at these numbers. 56%, 55% of the time, 55% of the time, 53% of the time, 52% of the time, 48% of the time, 47% of the time, 45% of the time. So it's kind of 50-50. It helps, all right? Certainly helps, but it doesn't always prevail. The people often, especially, remember I told you, time and education also make a difference. Money also makes a difference. Congressional structure is very open and porous. It's easy to access Congress. It used to be a lot easier before 9/11. I mean, frankly, anybody could walk into Congress at any time and just walk up to their member's office and knock on the door and say, hey, I'd like to talk to you. I'm a constituent. And whenever I was an intern in DC for a member of Congress, there was never a constituent that he turned away. He talked to every constituent that knocked on his door. And so if the constituent was from the glass workers union, then he was still going to talk to him. Whereas he may not talk to a national representative from the glass workers union. There's committees and subcommittees where we're making a lot of these policy decisions, where we're working out, hammering out the details, and so that gives their staff there too. I actually worked on that member of Congress's staff, and so people would call directly and talk to staff members. And there are huge staffs, especially on the Senate side, okay? Huge staffs. And so there's lots of people that you can kind of get in someone's ear about an issue. It's ideal for any degree of influence. And then, there's money. This is just Tom Cole's campaign. And then I think this is 2018 receipts. So the Williams Company, Political Action Committee, gave Tom Cole $5,000. The USA Farm Workers gave $5,000. Chamber of Commerce, $5,000. Spirit Aero Systems, $5,000. Prosperity Action, $5,000. National Automobile Dealers Association, Political Action. The reason you can't buy your car directly from Ford, right? $5,000. Devon Energy Corporation, Political Action, $5,000. Every single one of them gave the maximum that they could to him that year. 3 out of those are, 2 out of those are energy. 1 is ideological. Chamber of Commerce is broad business. Automobile dealers, obviously, more focused. And Aero Systems, more focused. And then farm workers, more focused. So we have some concerns about the pressure system. This is that last question. It's kind of a big one. Just so you know, this would be the question I would ask as an essay question, right? We have concerns about the pressure system. The first is elite bias, right? Remember, we've been talking about that a lot, okay? We've talked about that a lot. Again, in the pluralist heaven, the choir sings with an upper-class accent. E.E. Schachtschneider, who also said that political parties are necessary. They're what make democracy, is also saying, hey, look, when we're talking about access of interest groups, we're talking about people who have education and money. It's tilted toward business and the professions because economic motives are much more easy to organize. Okay? Whenever I was working as an attorney the first time in my first law firm, I had a paralegal in the year 2000 who was deciding whether to vote for Al Gore or George W. Bush. And she looked at both of their tax plans, and George W. Bush's tax plan would ensure that she had $200 more in her pocket at the end of the year. $200. And that's who she voted for. That's the way she was thinking about it, right? It's easier to organize. And then we also have that free rider problem. People who get involved are people who have time and money. And a lot of us don't pay attention, right? These are average citizens' preferences, and this is the percent favoring proposed policy change. This is how often it gets passed. 20% of the time, no matter who prefers it. 20% of the time it gets passed, no matter the level of preference, right? 100% of the people, 20% of the time, it gets passed, right? 0%, 20% of the time, it gets passed. If we talk about economic elites' preferences, then it increases. The passage is greater the more preference there is. Okay? Business interest groups spend 5 times more on lobbying, as I said before, than they do as compared to campaign donations. We have very little independent influence for mass groups. These are just some of the sector titles. Finance, that's how much they're given. Ideological and single issue groups, kind of next, other. And then miscellaneous business, so finance, insurance, real estate, miscellaneous business, health, lawyers and lobbyists, communications, electronics, labor, energy, natural resources, agribusiness, construction, transportation, and defense. All of the ideological and single issue groups fit together in that. Our second problem, our second concern, is that broader public interest is sacrificed. Remember I was talking about it's hard to break through all the information, all the chatter, right? And so this kind of idea of what's really good for us, what would be the best path to follow, gets sacrificed because the Pacific Whale Foundation has a really strong advocacy group. What's the broader public interest? And this is called demosclerosis. And the key is this: the sum of group interest does not equal public interest as a whole. Right? If you add together the NRA and the Sierra Club and the ACLU and the Pacific Whale Foundation and the World Wildlife Federation and the Oil and Gas Federation and, then you don't end up with public interest. Right? It's easier to block legislation for these interest groups than it is to enact legislation. And so if something is a problem for one group, it's easier to block that, even though it's a broader public interest. And it's really going to sap the flexibility of government. We have this policy that becomes really dense because we're trying to buy off all these different demands. We're trying to meet all these interests. Oh, I didn't take roll. Will you take roll, Eric?
Yep.
Sorry about that, guys. Here's the third one. Here's the third concern. The submerged state. Submerged state. People are completely unaware of what government actually does. I think I was talking about this Boise City article I read the other day, in which people in Boise City said, the problem is the government. And I'd like to point out to the people of Boise City that they exist because the government is subsidizing them so heavily. Okay? But they're unused of their aware of public programs. Keep your government hands off my Medicare. I was at a town hall meeting with Tom Cole in Lawton. And people were saying, and those of you in the military will appreciate this, TRICARE works perfectly good. I don't want the government messing that up. And Tom Cole went, you're right. But listen to what I'm saying. The government pays for that, and we're unaware of it. Half of you as program recipients believe they have not used a government program. Half believe they have never used a government program. And it tends to shower benefits to the affluent, especially through the tax code, because we're not paying attention. There's a kind of a bigger graph. So which is your biggest concern? Have we done attendance?
Yeah.
Okay, so after attendance, I have a quick poll. We might start with this next time instead. So think about that, which is your biggest concern. Until then, go out the back door. Boomer!